Hi, my name is Katharine Hayhoe. I'm a climate scientist, and I am delighted to be able to speak with you today, thanks to the miracles of modern technology, about why climate change matters to Nevada and how we can have positive, constructive conversations with people about an issue that has become the most politically polarized issue in the entire country at this time. Let's start by talking about what Nevadans think about climate change. The Yale program on climate communication has a fantastic set of maps showing our opinions on a lot of different questions related to climate change by county. Any county that is orange means more than 50% of people said yes. Anywhere that's blue, more than 50% said no. And the darker the color in either direction, the more extreme the yes or no answers are. So first of all, how many adults think global warming is happening? Across the entire country, it is 67%, so what, 2/3. And if we zoom in specifically on Nevada and on Carson City, we see that it is 65%, so just slightly below average. But then when you ask, how many people think that it's going to affect them personally, the picture is very different. This shows that across the entire country, even where people completely agree with the science, the vast majority think that it will not harm us personally. And zooming in on Nevada, you can see that we're at 40% here in Carson City. So even people who say, oh yes, climate is changing, humans are responsible, the impacts are serious, they're just not serious for me. What can we do about this? Well, the maps actually have the answer, and that is because the map I just showed you is not the darkest blue map they have. There is one more, and here it is. Do you ever talk about it? It turns out that only about 1/3 of people across the entire country discuss this issue, even occasionally. Zooming in on Nevada, we're at 35%, so just 1% below the national average. Now, let me connect the dots. If we don't talk about something, why would we care? And if we don't care, why would we act? So talking about it is absolutely critical to engaging on this issue. And in fact, scientific research has even showed that talking about climate change induces a true positive feedback effect, where the more we talk about it, the more people know. The more people know, the more concerned they are. The more concerned they are, the more they talk about it. How do we talk about it, though? Well, I want to start with what we don't do, and that is what most of us would immediately assume we should do. The first thing to do is not to fall for the smoke screens that people throw up to kind of subconsciously hide the real reasons why we object to climate change. What are those smoke screens? Well, we have a lot of sciencey sounding smoke screens, like it's just a natural cycle, it's been warmer before, it's the sun, it's volcanoes. And if you're looking to the answers for those, skepticalscience.com and our Global Weirding series on YouTube have fantastic articles and episodes about the sciencey sounding myths. But those really are myths. They're smoke screens for the real problem. What do religious-y sounding objections sound like? Well, God is in control, so humans can't affect the earth, or the world's going to end anyway, so why does it matter? But when you look at the Bible, for example, it directly contradicts those. It says humans have responsibility over every living thing on this earth. And then there's the economic arguments. It'll cost too much to fix it. It'll let China take over the world. Well, if we don't fix it, it's going to cost a lot more than if we do. But these are the smoke screens. So when people come up with these smoke screens, we can certainly say, no, that's not true. It isn't volcanoes. But engaging endlessly with the smoke screens will be kind of like Don Quixote tilting at windmills. We'll never get to the root of the problem. What is the root of the problem? The root of the problem is this. First of all, the fact that the number one predictor of whether we agree with basic science going back 200 years that says that climate is changing and humans are responsible, the number one predictor of whether we agree with that is simply our politics. So who we associate ourselves with, how we identify politically, is part of the problem. We feel like if we're conservative, if we're fiscally conservative, or if we support a free economy, or if we're Republican, we can't be on board with the idea that climate is changing. The second problem is the one we saw in the maps, psychological distance. We think that climate change will affect future generations, or people or places or animals who live far away, but we don't think it will affect us, even if we agree with the science. And the third real problem is solution aversion. We have been told that the only solutions to climate change are negative and punitive. They're harmful, they're expensive, they'll make our life worse, not better. And I don't know about you, but if the solutions are just going to make all of our lives worse, then I would say, why bother, right? It just makes sense. So let's dig into how do we address the real problems. The first most dangerous myth we've bought into is that I have to be a certain type of person to care about climate change, and I'm not. Again, you have to be a liberal or a tree hugger or a socialist or, somebody who cares about animals and plants more than people. But the reality is that we all live on this one planet, and we cannot float around in outer space without the resources that this planet gives us. This planet gives us, just think about it for a minute, the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, the materials that we use to make everything that we have. It comes from this planet, no matter what part of the political spectrum we identify with. So the truth is, to care about a changing climate, we only have to be one thing, and that is a human living on planet Earth. What's the second most dangerous myth? This is the one related to psychological distance, the idea that climate change is a distant issue. It only affects future generations or people or places that are far away. But the reality is that it affects every single one of us, because our society is built on an assumption that we don't often think about, that climate is stable. So we can have hot and cold, we can have wet and dry, but we assume that the long-term average and the highs and lows that we have seen in the past, we assume that these are perfect predictors of what the future will be like. And so we build our entire society based on the past, from our building codes to what type of crops we grow, where and when and how, the energy and water demand that we plan for, the 100 and 500 year flood zones, and much more. It's all built on the assumption of a stable climate. This type of planning is like driving down the road looking in the rear view mirror at where you've been in the past to keep you on the road. And, just to be clear, it works great when the road is straight. If the road is straight and climate is not changing, then looking backwards at where we've been is a perfect predictor of the future. But what happens when there's a curve in the road? When there's a curve in the road, we have to take our eyes off the rearview mirror. We have to look forwards to make sure that we make it around that curve. And today, climate is changing. Our average temperatures are increasing, our rainfall patterns are shifting, our precipitation is becoming more extreme, our heat extremes are becoming more frequent. We care about a changing climate because it alters future conditions that affect our infrastructure, our resources, our health, and more. Not just that, but our variability is also changing. So we care about climate change because it takes the risks we already face today and it exacerbates them or makes them worse. Like what? Well, for example, we know that since the 1980s, Nevada has had 18 disasters that have cost at least $1 billion worth of damage. If we break these down, we see that 7 of these were drought, then 9 of these were wildfire. We know that we always have a chance of rolling a double 6 on the weather dice naturally. So what is that double 6? The double 6 is the wildfire, the drought, or the flood. But as climate changes, it's taking one of those numbers and then another of those numbers and another of those numbers and turning them into 6s or even the occasional 7. How? Well, for example, the area burned by wildfire since the 1980s has more than doubled as a result of a changing climate compared to what it would have been without a changing climate. So we're still seeing the same number of wildfires, but what we're seeing is they're burning more than twice the area now in the hotter, drier conditions of a warmer world. That's how climate change is loading the dice against us, right here and right now. The reality is that climate change is a threat multiplier. That's not my own term, that comes from the US military. It takes the threats we face today and it multiplies them or makes them worse. The truth is that climate change is already affecting us here and now. We're on to myth 3 now. Now that one was, remember, solution aversion. And the third most dangerous myth we've bought into is the myth that the only viable solutions are bad. They are harmful, they are punitive, they're even immoral. I've heard people tell me the only solution to climate change is abortion. And I can't agree with any of them. The truth is that there are positive, beneficial solutions from across the political spectrum. And when we ask people, not do you want to fix climate change, but when we ask people, do you agree with a specific solution, guess what? They actually say yes. And here's the proof. How many people support funding research into renewable energy? It is dark orange across the entire country. How many people support tax rebates if we buy energy efficient vehicles or solar panels? Over 80% of us support that. How many of us think that corporations should do more to address global warming? 67% of us, which is a higher number than actually think global warming is real. Isn't that interesting? In other words, we are all for solutions. It's just when we get into the muddy waters of politics that the wheels start to fall off the bus. Here's the craziest one in my opinion. Do you support increasing taxes on fossil fuel companies while reducing other taxes to cut carbon emissions? And this is the method that nearly every economist in the world, including the 2 who won the Nobel Prize for Economics 2 years ago, agree is the most effective way to reduce carbon emissions. It turns out that 66%, 2/3 of the country, is on board with even that. And then when we ask, do we think Congress should do more to address global warming? Even there, we're at 60%. And if you look in at Nevada, there's a couple of counties where it's just below 50, but most counties would agree that their congressperson should be doing more. Isn't that fascinating? So when we have these conversations, don't begin with what we most disagree on. Begin by having a conversation about something that you already agree on. You might not think it has anything to do with climate change, but that's where you're directly connecting to each other, overcoming the political identity politics problem. Then we connect the dots between what we already care about and how climate change is affecting it, and that addresses the psychological distance problem. And lastly, we have to inspire each other with positive, practical solutions, because what's the point of talking about a problem if we don't know what to do about it? And that's where addressing the solution aversion comes in. So don't begin the conversation by pulling out all the science and hitting people upside the head with it. Begin by talking about something that you might both care about. I have lots of examples of how to do this in my TED Talk. I did not give you my TED Talk today. It's different. It gets way into, how do you talk to different type of people and where would you start that conversation? But just to give you a few samples, you can start the conversation with values that we share, whether it's things we enjoy doing outside, our family, a shared faith, the place that we live, the fact that we're both members of the Rotary Club, we both care about the economy and jobs. Begin the conversation with something even, I've seen conversations start well when they began over something as trivial as cooking or knitting or beer. Then we connect the dots to why it matters to us in the place where we live or in the ways that we live. Lastly, we have to talk about inspiring solutions. Solutions like clean energy, revolutionizing poor countries, or the fact that reducing food waste is a huge way that we can reduce our personal carbon footprint. The fact that there's more jobs in solar energy than in fossil fuels across the US, or churches are putting solar panels on their roof, Or here in Texas, wind turbines are replacing old oil rigs. You might say, that's all fine because you're a scientist, but I'm not. The reality is that when we look at the social science, it turns out the number one best messenger on climate change is you. Friends and family are the most trusted messengers. So everyone can speak to their friends, their family, their neighbors about climate change. The bottom line is having that conversation about climate change is the most important thing that each one of us can do, and you are the perfect person to have it. Now, I know there's so much more to unpack when it comes to climate change, but you have an expert right there with you. Mike Dettinger is a fellow climate scientist. He has studied the impacts of climate change on the American West, and he knows more than anyone else exactly how climate change is going to affect us and what we can do to prepare for it. If you'd like more information, you can always find me online on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram. Thank you again for having me, and have a great conference.